Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining our session today. Last session of the day, the home stretch. Thank you all for making it this far. My name is John Sarreal. I'm a Director of Product Management at Experian, part of their Global Identity and Fraud Group. And I'm here with Cindy White, VP of Global Marketing for Mitek, and Kathleen Peters, SVP and Head of Identity and Fraud for Experian North America. To get us started, I was kind of curious about who we have in the audience today. So if you're a technology provider, maybe raise your hand or stand up. Can I get a sense for who's providing technology? All right, what about if you're a service provider? If you're a bank or a merchant providing services to consumers? Anyone here for that? Okay. And who here truly offers frictionless customer experiences? Oh, all right. Well, we'll have to challenge your perspective on things. So that question is actually the genesis of today's topic. What the friction? How do we build consumer trust with transparency while providing a sense of security? So, most of the time, or most of the sessions that I've attended at this conference have been about creating frictionless customer experiences and reducing the amount of friction while maintaining trust. I think we have, our panelists today have a perspective that actually says that actually sometimes friction is necessary and sometimes friction is expected and even desired by some consumers. So that's the topic that we hope to explore today. I wanted to start off by having Cindy introduce herself to the group, and maybe if you could provide your perspective on friction's role in today's identity verification landscape.
Thanks, John. So Cindy White, I work at Mitek, and I lead the global marketing organization, and we are a global company. So, friction to me is really around what does that mean and how is it relevant to each of the individual organizations, the regulations that might be present in those particular geographies, but also what does it mean to their consumers and what are their consumers expecting. Mitek is an organization that specializes in identity document verification. We partner across the spectrum of identity verification, but we are specialists around document verification and how we take the government-issued identity document and use that as a bridge into the digital world. So where you were expected to show your identity in a physical world, now it's acceptable to show that identity and to prove who you say you are in the digital world. We've been doing this, and we have a house of experts for about a decade or so. Our partners, like Experian, that we have around the globe, are helping us to really figure out how friction can really help the individual in their use case, help the consumer in their use case to understand that friction actually is a good thing. Okay. And it's not what the friction at all.
It's not the F word that we make it out to be. All right, and how about you, Kathleen?
Yeah, I'm Kathleen Peters, and I head our fraud and identity business in North America for Experian. And it's interesting in thinking about friction, and you mentioned, is friction the F word? And as we were getting ready for this session and thinking about what the title for this session should be, some of our mutual collective marketing folks were saying, well, is friction the F word? And then I was laughing because there was actually a session yesterday, I think, with almost that exact same title. And so thinking about friction and does it have a place, recently, in fact, in January, Experian released its annual 2019 Identity and Fraud Report. And this is an annual survey that we do each year, and it's a double-blind survey where we basically feel the temperature and feedback and the sentiment of consumers and businesses around fraud detection, identity verification, that space. And so in this particular case, in this year, we surveyed over 10,000 consumers, over 5,000 businesses, and asked these kinds of questions of what's important, what do they value in an experience. And what we heard loud and clear this year from the survey results was that consumers want a bit of friction. And to me, it's a little bit like a Goldilocks thing. You don't want too much, you don't want too little, you want it to be just right. And that just right felt like, I'm safe and secure. I know that there is some sort of verification going on, so I can trust the entity that I'm doing business with. And yet at the same time, I'm not so inconvenienced that I feel like I can't accomplish the transaction that I'm trying to undertake. And so, especially compared with last year and even the year before's survey, something on the order of 70% of consumers were saying that security was a top concern and they wanted some visible aspect of that when they transact. And so the right amount of friction, I think, is what consumers are asking for, at least in the current climate.
Great. All right, so maybe not everyone is super familiar with what's currently being used for identity verification. So maybe Kathleen, how would you characterize how consumers are verifying themselves and what their attitudes toward identity verification is today?
Yeah, so historically, in terms of identity verification and the way that many of us in industry think about that, especially for high-value transactions, is some sort of identity check of our physical identity information or our offline identity. So even if we are transacting digitally, there will be some sort of identity verification against a known offline ID information, name, address, maybe even social security number if it's associated with some sort of new banking enrollment or originations. Increasingly, though, especially in digital transactions, it's a layered approach. So there may be some signature associated with the device, a number of digital signals that may be attributed to behavioral biometrics or physical biometric. That might be layered with additional signals that come from some government-issued identity documentation verification, various kinds of step-up or multi-factor authentication. So today, the identity verification landscape is a much more complex, multi-layered approach and really somewhat dependent on the use case too, I think.
Okay. Yeah, and Cindy, we talked about, in preparation for this panel, we talked about the momentum that you guys are seeing in terms of document verification. Can you maybe characterize that for the audience here?
Yeah, I mean, if I was just to think about Mitek and what we're seeing, quarter over quarter, we're seeing 100% growth in transactions. Quarter over quarter, compounded, you can imagine that's momentum in itself. We also know that year over year, we're onboarding about 50% more net new customers. And then within our existing customers, they're also returning to us and saying, hey, help me with this problem. We realize that there's an identity verification requirement in this use case, which was something different to what they've traditionally done. An example of that would be inside of organizations where they have onboarded with a new account, but now they might be opening a different type of account. Mm-hmm. If you were to put that into the sharing economy, maybe they were a rider and now they want to be a driver. If you take it into a bank, maybe they have a checking account, but now they wanted to have a mortgage with that. There's different types of use cases that they're coming back and saying, how can you help us on the spectrum? Over and above that, I think when you think about how fast regulation is going internationally, they're keeping up with what is the momentum of this ID. And we certainly see it in terms of the amount of attendees at conferences like this, mm-hmm. and the amount of conferences. We had back-to-back conferences on ID just in this hotel. So I think momentum is for sure there. Yeah,
it's pretty evident too when you go to the expo hall and you just see a lot of the innovation and a lot of the new enterprises that are trying to attack this identity verification problem. So you talked about how you have customers that are coming back to you, even existing ones that are using or finding a need for identity verification in new use cases. I think maybe it would be helpful to describe what some of these use cases are and describe why different amounts of friction are really necessary based on the use case.
Yeah, and they really are. Different amounts of friction are acceptable, and sometimes Kathleen mentioned it in her study as well, that it's expected almost. Mm-hmm. And so let's take an example of where you have a driver for Instacart, perhaps. And so they've been driving for Instacart, but Instacart needs to validate that particular driver is actually who he says he is months down the line. We don't want the recipient of the groceries to have an axe murderer show up at their front door, right? And so it's a conundrum that Instacart would, or anybody with a driver would find themselves in, where they want to validate that, but it's a spot check, so they don't want necessarily the driver to figure out how to scam that. Right. They also don't want to scare their particular buyers that this is a requirement, right? So they have this thing called continual authentication, where it's more spontaneous, and that's a use case that we're partnering with them to figure out how they can do that instantaneously. There can't be any friction in that, right? Sure. It's got to be quick, validate who you are, and move on. Whereas something along the lines that it's a wealth management or a high loan account that is being transferred, you would expect that there would be some sort of friction.
Sure.
And this is another type of multi-use case in one transaction. If you were to take a mortgage, up front you expected to identify who you are and that you're going to be signing these documents. But as you go through and things get validated through that, you might have to again prove your identity using identity document or a selfie at
Sure.
the end to align with your digital signature.
Okay.
So all of those use cases, it's one big transaction over
Yep.
multiple days, but the friction would be different based on those different things.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think that use case is one example of where you would decide how much friction to use. I think there's another aspect too, which might be around the calculated risk or the assessed risk on the transaction itself. So even within the same use case, depending on some of the signals that you're seeing or some of the initial parts of your orchestrated flow and verifications that you're doing, you may have an indication that there's a high potential of fraud. Mm-hmm. And in that case, if one of your solutions or one of your services is saying, I have a high likelihood or I've passed a threshold that this may be fraud, mm-hmm. then I may want to send my happy path clients down one way where I reduce the friction as much as possible. And for those where I have a high likelihood of fraud, I may want to actually put them on a very high friction path. So that if I do let them through, at least that I know they've gone through some additional step-up types of authentication, or they will more likely fall out. The more friction that you add to a fraudster, the more likely they are then to fall out before they actually transact. So I think even within use cases, there are ways to do a risk assessment associated with the signals that you have at that moment in time.
And then there's different technologies that you can apply based
Right.
on those risk assessments. So, if the score is that this is high probability that this is fraud, you might want to take it to a forensic level.
Right.
And that's where we at Mitek talk about leveraging our human intelligence. So we have a path that said we're going to use automated technology to take you to this sort of point, but then we're going to step you up to a manual, and if it's really high probability of risk, does this need forensic or expert attention, which is another service that we offer as well.
Yeah.
And obviously that's a lot of high friction, at which stage maybe the fraudster's dropped off, but if the person is really it's a high value transaction, they're probably prepared to put up with that in order for it to go through.
Yeah, and we also talked about how even within your normal document verification flow, you do have different levels of that. So I think it was the Instacart example, where if you're just, as part of that continuous risk flow, I think, Kathleen, you mentioned risk-based authentication, and I think that's a pretty commonly used technique to execute continuous authentication. But if there is some level of risk that's detected, if Instacart believes that they need to re-verify the driver, you mentioned how a different flow could be enacted. Can you describe kind of how the selfie flow might be different from the full flow?
Yeah, so there's different types of using a government-issued ID to prove that you are who you say you are. You can use actual elements of the document itself to authenticate, validate that it is the document that links you to the person. But if you weren't 100% sure or satisfied with that, then you can turn on the selfie check, which is matching the selfie image with the image on the card, right? Mm-hmm. And in the Instacart instance, they don't need the document part again. They just want to check that the person is the one that they have on file, right?
Right, yeah.
And so that's how you could use different parts of the workflow, different parts of the technology, different parts of the partner flow, based on what your requirements are.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to tie together the risk that's assessed to the way of elevating trust or verifying that the user is who they say they are. I think an interesting aspect of the fraud report from Experian was that it was global in nature. So maybe, Kathleen, what were some of the regional differences that we were able to call out in terms of consumer attitudes towards fraud?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there was definitely this question of the balance of convenience versus security. It was interesting that in Latin America, in that region, the survey respondents had a higher sensitivity in that they desired an even more visible security layer as they were engaging in high-value transactions. But even in the US and Western Europe, It was still an overwhelming majority, but you definitely saw that multiple, for example, in Latin America in terms of importance of security. In terms of the desire to have a layer of friction or versus convenience and what that looked like, definitely in our Asia Pacific and Southeast Asia countries where everything is much more online, everything is much more phone-based, there was less of a dependence or even a desire, understandability of what government ID documents might be a part of that kind of a flow. There's less consistency in that regard in those markets and other ways that folks are used to verifying their identity. So there was some sentiment, but then also some cultural norms that affected the differences there.
How about from a document verification perspective? Any regional differences?
I mean, obviously, when you think about government-issued IDs, they vary in the United States by state, right? So you can imagine by country, there's a plethora of documents that are changing weekly. If you were to take the whole of Europe, different parts of the continent is updating different parts of the technology. So if you take Italy, for instance, you would think that it would be more progressing towards a smaller card, but it's actually the paper-based document is the most used document, right? And then when you think about languages, and alphabets and things like that, it's hard for international companies to really standardize on a particular flow when there's so many documents to authenticate.
Sure.
So you can standardize on passports, I guess, is one of the ways that you could do it. And if you were to use human-assisted environments like manual, that would help an international company have the same workflow. But we certainly have to adjust our workflows based on the region or the location. And then in Europe, don't forget regulation. Regulation is global, but in Europe, it's a particular interest of the organization to comply. And they, when they're thinking about friction in their workload, they think about risk, they think about compliance, and then they think about convenience. And they weight those in order to get the best experience possible within what they are bound to do in terms of compliance. So definitely regional differences, but there are ways to achieve them. And I think what's most important is understanding what the customer expects.
Sure.
So you spoke about the cultural differences. We found through a consumer survey that we did with Zogby that in the United States, our threshold and our acceptance here to trust a platform is growing. We're going to put up with more friction than even last year, knowing that the platform that we're going to transact on is safe and secure. So we're prepared to put up with a little bit more friction. Whereas those platforms aren't as proliferant in Europe yet, right? So they're still thinking about convenience and mobility and things like that, but they have more compliance. So it's just really working with the corporate enterprise to understand what is their priority. How do they weight convenience over risk, over a security, reputation, and taking all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's interesting as you talk about comfort level too. It makes me think about biometrics, and I know that with the Mitek solution, you have the ability to have a selfie as part of the matching verification. What we found in the survey too is there's an increased comfort level with biometrics in general. I think it makes sense. People are more and more accustomed to there being a biometric login on their smartphone, and there's been a consumerization of that across demographics. People are more and more comfortable with some level of biometric, and they are sensing it as secure. One thing that the survey and the fraud report found was that consumers actually, their trust in a transaction goes up 70% when a biometric is involved in their access or their login to the service. Again, I think that comfort level, it's significant. Last year it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40%, which showed a good and growing comfort level. It's almost not only ubiquitous now that it's comfortable, but people do feel that when that biometric piece is used, it adds an extra level of security, and they're more comfortable transacting with the party on the other side.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I would say, ask the audience, of the people here, who thinks that actually a biometric authentication represents friction being added to a transaction? Because I think some of us, and Right. But if it's right,
in that case, it's almost easier than having to key in a password or something.
That's right, yeah. People who are using Touch ID and Face ID.
Right, depending on the situation.
Right, so I think even the nature of how biometrics is positioned, I think turns that question about friction on its head a little bit.
I think it's something we've all had to get comfortable with, right? I remember when they first announced the iPhone 10, and it was log in with your face, and maybe folks like me of a certain age weren't so comfortable necessarily with logging in with my face, and where is that being stored, and what does it mean? I know in the case of Apple, they've made it very clear that they're actually storing it in the secure hardware of the device itself as opposed to sending it to a cloud. But it's interesting to think about that as a login scheme and how much more comfortable the general public has gotten, even with something like a facial recognition scheme.
Yeah, there was a really interesting session earlier, a debate whether or not facial recognition should be the biometric standard, and something that was called out was that your face is sort of like a public biometric that is widely sort of published. It's not something that anyone can necessarily steal because your image is out there. All right, so we talked about biometrics as sort of emerging. Are there any other emerging risks or fraud types that you see as being kind of relevant or requiring some additional friction?
I can take that one just to start with. I know one thing that we saw an increase in just from our own business is an increase this year in what we call familiar fraud. And this is where credentials or identity information are used by someone known to the owner of those credentials. So for example, if a child uses their parents' credentials, or a friend uses willingly or knowingly or unknowingly the credentials of someone they're familiar with or that they know. And there's a notion about that kind of fraud. And so in some cases that, maybe that's all right and it's even okay with the party who's provided it, but it's presenting fraudulent information or perhaps incorrect information for the transaction that's presented. So we've seen an increase in that type of fraud. And in fact, things like a document verification as part of that flow will actually detect that kind of fraud up front. It's something like a first-party fraud, yet with borrowed credentials of someone who is familiar to the person presenting them. So it's a different kind of fraud, and it's a third-party fraud detection scheme is not as likely to net those types of fraudulent activities, and they are on the rise. I think as the economy trends toward what may be a slowdown, all the economists are watching that right now, to see if we may be heading toward an economic slowdown in the next sort of 12 to 24 months. I think we're going to see an increased incidence of this type of fraud, some first-party fraud, just as the economy may start to slow and folks have a need. We're going to have to think about what our identity verification and fraud detection approaches will be for that kind of marketplace.
Sure.
For me, it's not so much the fraud as it is the proliferation of use cases. And so when I think about everything going online, think about the concept of screening. So whether that's employment screening, whether that's age screening, so with all of the new and exploding availability of cannabis in Southern California and so forth, there's going to be, how can folks prove that this person's of age, that they are the right person to get this? There's a lot of screening required when you're purchasing medicines online and things like that. And so the screening use case is definitely growing for us, and we're seeing more requirement around that. Another idea another use case that we've seen through one of our customers, Avis, is really proving that somebody is using their driver's license and not an identity document. And the more you start to really think about all of our industries and digital transformation, and that we're all going online at some point, there's just an explosion of use cases in terms of when we would have to prove who we are. Sure. And I think that is allowing us to collaborate with one another to figure out, okay, well, how can we make this as frictionless as possible, but communicate with the user that, okay, you used to do this in physical environment. You used to be able to show your professional credentials by sending a copy of your degree or whatever the case may be, or that your references were now they're all digitized. Okay, there's going to be a little bit of friction while we go through this hiring process, right? Sure. And so I think there's going to be an acceptance of some friction along the way with these use cases.
All right, I'm curious to get some feedback from the audience. Any questions that you guys have for our panelists? What are your thoughts on friction? Yeah, please.
Yeah, actually, I had a question. So, what I found interesting sort of comments, everybody's focused solely on the online channel. And
Okay.
my question is, like, what if that doesn't work? Let's fall back to, kiosk, show up in person somewhere, call somebody, mail something in, and how you actually deal with people. We've heard a couple of things talking about omnichannel, but a lot of this has talked about like online is everything, and it's a growing breed, but there's also need to provide fallbacks for edge cases where things don't work. So, and you get into workforce training, you can adjudicate something, and it becomes harder to scale and much more expensive to scale and do consistently. So I was kind of curious to hear people's thoughts on channels other than strictly online.
Sure, yeah. So the question's what to do about non-online channels, where the
Right.
focus of this and all of our vendors has been really on the online channel.
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, I think we've all seen evidence where when fraud starts to be addressed and at least halted to some degree in the digital channel, where fraudsters will often go next is to some sort of call center. At that point, they can potentially social engineer, creating a new login, getting credentials, or even being able to transact via a call center representative. Historically, we've had good success, and as I know many of our colleagues in industry and partners have as well, in equipping the call center operators with the same capabilities or even the ability to do some sort of multi-factor call out to the individual. So there may be the opportunity to send a one-time password to whomever you're speaking to on the phone. There's an opportunity even for old school KBA questions as a multi-factor type of step-up authentication. That continues to be a method for ID verification that lives on much longer than I could have ever predicted. It's still as part of a flow in some particular use cases. I actually think the document verification is another way where in the call center representative can send a text message out to a consumer, ask them to present a form of documentation digitally that will come back to the call center representative on their screen. So they can use some of the same techniques even in a less fully online situation. Another class of clients that we have are, for example, utility providers, cable providers, phone providers that may have an actual brick and mortar storefront of sorts. And the people who are on the floor there to register and enroll you for new service, whether it be phone, cable, et cetera, may be equipped with iPads or other digital means that they're walking the floor with. And instead of a minimum wage person having to validate whether your driver's license is real or not, or you are who you say you are, that can actually link back to a back office that has a number of the same capabilities. So in this way, I think we do enable sort of a multi-channel, omni-channel, while still leveraging the technology itself.
And certainly one of our South American and our European office, Mitek acquired a company, eCar, that uses scanners to capture the document. Ultimately, it ends up in the same place for us from a digital perspective, but that is a very proliferant use case inside of hospitality, for instance. Capturing that information so that you're still giving a good experience for the next time the returning visitor comes and using it for loyalty and so forth. I think it's changing. Particularly the hospitality industry is going keyless, and I think there might have even been some representation here this week from those guys. But it is the digital. Everything ends up being digital though at some point, and we need to think about the fraud on that digital, which makes us verify identities all over again. So it's kind of this circle, right?
Thanks. Any other perspectives on friction from the audience? Any other questions? Yeah, out in the back.
Yeah, I think kind of relating to maybe what is friction and kind of what is rituals associated with authentication.
Rituals, yeah.
I think if there's, there's a lot of, like, one of our customers, like, they were working on them with an ATM use case, and like, walking into the ATM, and what they actually found was that, well, yes, people actually like the process of taking the pin, like this four-digit pin, which, by the way, doesn't really add much security at all. People don't really choose good pins at all, but I mean, it did make people feel better. But I think that these things, they change very quickly. As well. I mean, you mentioned some of the things around different cultures and different countries having different opinions. But even just across the course of 1 or 2 years, just things like Touch ID or Face ID. I mean, it used to be that people wouldn't trust an ATM because like I had to go to see the teller for them, I don't trust this ATM machine. And now these things change very quickly.
Yeah.
Having more friction being a good thing. I'm a little concerned that that's just an excuse to have bad product experience.
Yeah.
I mean, like, there's a lot of really, like, not very good experiences in authentication today. Especially things like KPA and these type of things that, I mean, honestly, like, they don't add much security and they're not good for users either.
Right.
And so I think that there's, for the longest time, that people, they had to adapt to this limitations of the technology and the products that exist. I think that that's like, with newer technologies, that's not starting to change. Acceptance of this type of technology is not starting to change as well. And so that I think there's a lot of opportunities now to have a revamped customer experience where it's, I wouldn't really call this friction, like in terms of you're maintaining some type of kind of rituals associated with authentication, but it's really an enhancement of the user experience.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think friction is it has a negative connotation, right? It's something you don't want in the process. And where our survey was showing us and what consumers are feeling is, I like how you put that. It's a comfort level with rituals. Why do they want the rituals? Because that builds trust. They will trust the transaction more. We will trust the transaction more if we go through a ritual by which we feel safe. Whether it is actually making us more safe or not, we want to feel like it is, and I really think it comes down to trust, and that will change over time. I absolutely do not believe that any of these particular high friction methods that we may introduce can stand alone and now the transaction is safe. I think we have to be combining a number of passive in the background techniques along with some that are more front-facing to make the consumer comfortable, as well as to add another layer in order to really feel good about the transaction and really to do that risk assessment, whether it's secure or not. But I like how you talk about it with the rituals. I think that's what was coming through in the survey. I need some level of comfort, some ritual that I follow that makes me feel like this is secure, or at least maybe that I have an active role in it. It was interesting. I take Lyft a lot, and I always like to ask the drivers, how long you've been driving for Lyft. Do you drive for both Lyft and Uber? I'm just curious about it. I live in San Francisco, and so in asking a recent driver, he was saying, I used to drive for both, but I don't drive for Uber anymore, and I just, I didn't like driving for them. I said, well, why? And he said, when I signed up and enrolled to be a driver for Uber, they approved me in just a matter of minutes. Whereas with Lyft, it took some hours for them to get back to me. And I'm thinking, this was good, this was bad, And but basically he said, I don't even know if Uber checked me. And if I'm actually a passenger, if I'm taking a ride, or if my mom is taking a ride, I want to think that at least that driver went through some sort of verification and check. And so even as the driver, he felt more comfortable and that he could trust the company that at least had some visible sign. It was interesting. Yes?
Yeah, so can I just get back to him just a little? When you talk about a ritual, I think what we've learned with our customers as they onboard these new identity verification techniques is that it's important to communicate what's happening. why are you taking a picture of my identity document, and why are you comparing it to my selfie, as opposed to just leaving them hanging, because that's bad friction, right? But using the time while we're verifying that in the background to actually communicate with them, what's going on, and maybe it's something else that becomes a ritual that said, oh, here's the icon that we are a SOX-approved authenticator, or you are about to enter onto a trusted platform, or something along those lines that allows it not to be a bad technology experience, but rather a more expected and ritual one, right?
I think we had another question in the middle.
Right. No, I think it is. Definitely influences. It's that familiarity. It's that comfort level. It's an understanding of why these things are being sought. I think that's true.
But you're also drawing a kind of a correlation between employee verification and friction that an employee needs to kind of go through, and eventually leading to consumer verification. If you think about, all of us kind of work for corporations, we have things like VPNs, right? And we know how frictionful signing into a VPN is, right?
In a conference center.
Right. But I do sense that, with some of the advanced IAM vendors, that's getting a little bit better, right? It's getting, instead of hauling or pulling out your RSA token, now you can just verify something on your phone, right? Maybe it's a mobile token, or maybe it's a mobile push notification. So I think that's an example where even in the enterprise space, friction is kind of being reduced. That's sort of how it might flow into the consumer experience as well. Up front and then further back.
I have a comment about friction and whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing working with customers and use cases. I have a customer that did an A/B study because they wanted to know, is asking for this ID up front causing me to have to fall off at the top of my funnel? And what they found was that it was kind of a 50-50. They didn't have to fall off, but people either liked the frictionless experience of completing an application without doing all the typing, and that piqued their interest. Some, knew they were going to go through and do typing in, and same thing with the school I worked with. They found that when students had to go to an admissions office, it was very frictionful. They had to arrange their schedule, whereas if they put the ID in, it was quick and easy. But with both of these customers, no one size ever fit all. And so I think that what I want to advise, you need various paths because you're going to have various demographics. And so if we go in for a one size fit all, it's going to fail.
So yeah, your comment about, like we were saying, friction, just the right amount, the Goldilocks effect of friction is necessary sometimes. One more comment back there.
I have a comment question around actually how long do you think that consumers will value friction? Because it's clear that it is kind of it makes us feel safe when we have some friction, right? But I think as time goes on and as these types of authentication interfaces are more and more common and we expect them, pretty much how long do you think that we'll value that friction? And then when is the turning point going to be that we're educated and we understand that this verification happens quickly and we actually don't?
Yeah, so when does friction go away, guys?
Well, I think it just becomes a different type of friction. So if you think about what the World Bank and the United Nations are trying to do, they're trying to give us all a digital identity by 2030. And with that digital identity, it's just going to be a different type of friction. So right now we're using documents to help us, or we're using a combination of multi-layered approach with documents to help us. And so as we're getting more expert or more polished in our workflows, that friction's going to get less, and the expectation is going to be that it's shorter and faster and whatever else. But then along comes a new service because there's a new technology or there's a new whatever. So I just think it's about us as vendors in the space of identity being upfront about what we think could be, and for you to share what you think it could be so that we can help it along. But I think it's just a different type of friction. You know, we were having a conversation with a customer earlier today, and he reminded us of the awful experience of an e-fax. And I'm dating myself. But you know, I remember when it was like, oh, this is so much better than going to the fax machine with my photocopy of my ID book and sending it. Now I can do it on my machine. Like, it was like hallelujah. And now we're in this place where it's completely digital. So I just think it's a different type of friction that's going to come with something different.
I think it's not just technology too. I think it's also the world around us. I don't remember when I've heard so many references of late to Edward Snowden, and as well as Facebook, and I think the world is changing, and I think we're all looking for a little bit more security of late. We certainly saw that in our survey. There was a security awareness and desire last year's survey. This year it was much more increased. I think it's because of everything that we're hearing in the news. If you had a chance to attend yesterday afternoon's keynote and you heard Roger talking about Tor network and the privacy awareness there, I think it's more in our general consciousness too of we're starting to wonder, who is managing our information? What are they doing with it? What are folks collecting and why? And so I think as that evolves too, the friction that we'll accept will change in technical nature, as well as our own desire, our own comfort around certain rituals and traditions will evolve. So I think it's going to be ever-changing, frankly.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? I think this has been a great dialogue. One more, yeah.
From the consumer point of view or from the enterprise point of view? From the consumer point of view. Yeah, absolutely. So I think it really comes down to the value of what you're receiving. And I keep coming back to the survey. This is a free survey, by the way. It's available online. Anybody who wants it, some really interesting pieces of information in there. We actually found that folks were more willing to share more information if the entity they're transacting with was transparent about the data being collected and how they were going to use it, and whether they felt they were receiving value equivalent as a result of the transaction. So I think that there's going to be a desire amongst consumers to want to have a better visibility and transparency as to what's going on, how is my data being used, what of my data do you need, based on the value that I expect to receive from that transaction. Perfect example. I'll give you one example just for fun. In fact, John was with me. We were visiting a partner in San Francisco, and we were at a Pete's Coffee in the ground floor of a big office building. And we went out to the lobby just to ask about using the restroom. And there was a guard stationed there for the building. And as I went up to the desk, I said, I'd just like to use the ladies' room. And he said, I need your ID. I said, oh, I don't work in the building, actually. I just need to use the restroom. He said, no, I need to have your ID. And I'm thinking to myself, especially working in the industry that we all work in, why does this guy need my driver's license so that I can go to the restroom? It was a really unnecessary amount of information to have to provide so that he could hand me literally a key attached to a brick so that I could go down the hallway and use the ladies' room. In this case, the ID was a piece of collateral. But it's a bit of unnecessary information to have to provide for the value that I was receiving. Depending on how badly you need to use the ladies' room, it can have a lot of value. So I handed over my ID. But in any case,
perfect amount of friction, right?
The perfect amount of friction, but maybe really, not. Makes you think twice.
Right,
so.
Brings to the forefront that privacy versus
exactly.
value discussion. All right, well, I want to thank our panelists, Cindy White and Kathleen Peters, for joining us today and sharing their expertise on friction. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Yeah, thanks.